Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and today we want to talk about Peter as a source for Mark's Gospel as we continue our study of the life and letters of the Apostle Peter. Mark's Gospel, I think, could just as easily be called Peter's Gospel, because every historical source that puts Mark's name to this Gospel, and he doesn't sign it, not by name, although I do think he makes an appearance, the young man Mark, in the Gospel of Mark. Every source that tells us Mark wrote this Gospel tells us that he was recording what he heard Peter preach. And I just will run through the names. If you want to Google these folks, you can look them up. But from the second generation of Christians on down to the fourth or fifth generation of Christians, it was understood that Peter was the source of Mark's Gospel. Papias, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Eusebius all say that Mark wrote the Gospel and that Mark was writing what he heard Peter preach. There's a lot of internal evidence in the New Testament to suggest this. We mentioned yesterday that we know from the end of 1 Peter, Mark is with Peter in Rome after Paul has died. And so we have proximity, we have opportunity for the Apostle Peter to have that sort of influence on Mark. There are also internal evidences that don't prove Peter's authorship, or let me not say authorship, that do not prove that Peter is the source of the gospel, but are consistent with that notion. I think the main thing is it's clear from Mark's gospel that Mark's gospel is an oral text. In other words, it is either a transcript of preaching or a text for preaching, or maybe it's both. Maybe Mark is writing down what he heard Peter preach so others could memorize it and preach it as well. But it's an oral text. In the same way we know that the originals of the Iliad and the Odyssey are oral texts. All the earmarks of that which was originally spoken and then written down are there. There's the brevity of the stories. There's the vividness, the report of things being experienced through the five senses. There are the refrains that act as mnemonic devices. And it came to pass, which is an Old Testament mnemonic device, but we also find it in Mark's Gospel in Greek. Also, the word immediately. Things immediately happen. And that word immediately is a refrain over and over again. There's not a lot of red letter in Mark's Gospel. If you have a red letter Bible where the words of Jesus are in red, you can tell that Mark is full of action, full of detail, visual, vivid detail, in a way that John's Gospel is not. You do not find 30 verses of uninterrupted words by Jesus in Mark's Gospel. You just don't, because this Gospel quite clearly is a spoken text. It's either the transcript of his preaching, the assembled notes from his preaching, or it is a produced text so that people who want to preach and have a reliable source can have an oral source. And that's why I believe we have such wonderful detail in Mark's Gospel. It's also true, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way, Mark's Gospel, the Greek in Mark's Gospel generally is very poor. In other words, clearly, whoever is writing this down is listening to someone for whom Greek is not a primary language. And so compared to Luke, for instance, Luke is very polished. Mark's Gospel is not. John's Gospel is polished as well, but has a very small vocabulary. And of course, John has had the better part of the first century to get proficient in Greek. Mark's Gospel, the Greek is pretty bad until you get to the end. And so there's that as well. There's also the fact that Peter is much more a minor character in Mark's Gospel than he is in John's Gospel. There are times when Peter doesn't even identify himself in the story. And that would be consistent with the humility that we would expect Peter to have in telling the story. And the times that he does appear, and of course this is all a matter of opinion, but there are several times when he does appear that he seems to be presented in a less of a positive light than he is in the other Gospels. The walking on the water episode, for instance, is one that is often cited. I don't know that you can go to the bank on that. I mean, that really is, awfully I can't find the word I'm looking for. But anyway, that really is a matter of stretching your imagination to figure that out. That's speculative, I should say. That's the word I was looking for. But the historical evidence to me is overwhelming that Mark's gospel was written by Mark. That's what Papias says around the turn of the first century, when John was still writing, and that he's writing what he heard Peter preach. And to me, that gives us something of an explanation for the strange ending of Mark's gospel, because Mark's gospel, it ends sort of abruptly, and the ancient texts show the strange ending with the women seeing the empty tomb and walking away afraid. And then there's a shorter ending that is not quite so prevalent as the longer ending which we have, beginning in verse 9. And immediately the Greek becomes polished, and it's a different hand, quite clearly in the text. If Mark is writing down, assembling what Peter had preached, maybe Peter gets to this point, and that's kind of where then the sermon itself goes off in a variety of directions, and he's ready to give the invitation based upon his audience. Or maybe Peter dies before Mark finishes his work, but Mark has spent his life as an evangelist, and he can finish it in his own hand. Anyway, I don't know exactly how it happened, but I know there are multiple explanations for why. It just it just fits into the thought, the narrative that Peter is the source of Mark's gospel, and we should not be surprised for a variety of reasons that perhaps we have a different hand in Mark 16 verses 9 and following than we have before. Or maybe I should not say a different hand, but a different voice. Well, I've rattled on and on today, taken up 8 minutes of your time. Thank you for joining me for 5 good minutes with the Word. I hope 5 of them were good. And we'll see you next time.